capture every bizarre moment in Make My Day at 10:30. Now, though, Channel 4 discovers the truth about one of Britain's most successful authors.
My northeast is the picture of the slump. That is my northeast. The empty bellies, women pawning everything they had, and people in Jarrow selling the furniture for to eat. That is my northeast.
Catherine created the figure that she wanted to be in the way that an actress creates the role that she's playing, almost as if she was a character in one of her own novels.
Catherine seems to have almost formulated a story, the definitive story of her own life and her own childhood, which she then told for the rest of her life.
I'm afraid the cliché is rags to riches, but you realise that there could be a lot of big gaping holes, and there could be a lot of stories that you yourself think are absolutely true, but may not be. So I think what you got was, appropriately enough, a myth.
Catherine Cookson, one of our most popular writers, turned her life into fiction. She wrote historical novels set in the Northeast, drawing on memories of her tough Tyneside childhood. Cookson's writing made her into a multi-millionaire. She sold over 100 million books in her lifetime and is still the most borrowed author from our public libraries.
Catherine Cookson was a trailblazer who regularly published 2 books a year and always went to the top of the bestseller list.
She had this extraordinary narrative power. I mean, one's absolutely got to hand it to her. She was the real thing. She was a terrific storyteller.
In her autobiography, Our Kate, Cookson portrays herself as a heroine from one of her own novels. A victimised, illegitimate child from the back streets of Jarrow who makes good.
I was born right there, next to the pub. And it's very significant. I had to be born next to a pub because my granda, he didn't only drink, he washed himself in it. He was a drunken, ignorant Irishman who could neither read nor write. But it was him who brought me up.
There were very few times when you were discussing things with her that she didn't revert in some way to the childhood. Of course, you have to remember that my childhood was like this, as if it was still there within her, and she was never going to forget it.
Her novels reflected her obsession with her childhood.
A queer sense of shame filled the lavatory, flowing over into the yard, the house, and all the world of her knowledge. There was no place it did not penetrate. Great tears rolled down her cheeks, dropping heedlessly from her chin. She had no da. Was that why her grandad didn't like her and never called her Annie?
Catherine wanted it worse. You could never argue with her that maybe your upbringing or your childhood was in any way near as bad as hers.
Catherine's early years were relatively comfortable. Born in Tyne Dock in 1906, she was brought up by her grandparents, dock worker John McMullen and his wife Rose. They doted on her and treated little Kitty as their own daughter.
She was spoiled something rotten in those first 5 years. She had whatever she wanted, whatever they could afford to give, but she was forever performing for them in the kitchen, folding the clippy mat back and singing a song. She was the apple of their eye. She expected people to be interested in her.
When Catherine's grandmother Rose became ill, her older sister Kate returned home to look after the family. Catherine's cosy world was turned on its head.
For the first 7 or 8 years of her life, Catherine believed that Kate was her sister. And then she was told that Kate was her mother. By that time, it was too late for any real bonding. and there was a considerable amount of resentment.
Catherine had been conceived when Kate, a former barmaid, had an affair with one of her customers. Kate was fun-loving. She was known for liking a drink. But Cookson's memories of her mother focused on the humiliation her drinking habits brought.
There isn't anybody in this world that could have stopped her feeling things so exquisitely painfully. She felt everything 150% more than most people. Now, when her mother Kate was drinking and the neighbours came in and they saw Kate singing with that slack jaw, and every time she came to Catherine, she stank of whiskey. It was just a sheer disappointment.
She was bending down to me, and the hateful smell of whiskey wafted from her as she said, "Give us a kiss." My stomach turned over. I wished she was dead. I pushed her face away with the flat of my hand and I hissed at her, "I hate you. I do. I hate you, our Kate." Never have I seen such a look on anyone's face before or since.
The mother must have been so aware of the daughter's hostility and critical hatred of her drinking habits, and that her daughter would have liked her dead rather than alive.
Catherine felt victimised. Her strict Catholicism led her to believe she was being punished. She had recurring dreams in which she burnt in hell's flames. In Our Kate she wrote, "With God came priests in the confessional, nightmare, purgatory, and repentance and fear."
Father Bradley was, I didn't like him very much, to tell you the truth. Hell and damnation, you know, and your soul's going to go to hell. And it was a terrible time for Catholics. I mean, if the church says jump in the fire, we would have all jumped in the fire regardless of whether it was right or wrong. We're frightened to death. You mustn't go into another church as your eyes drop. And you know, you believed it.
Catherine blamed all her childhood miseries on her illegitimacy. In Our Kate, she tells how she was scorned by the other children for being a bastard. These stories of her victimization never lost their power for her.
Quite candidly, the party took place in that derelict house there. That was where the party took place. And I stood outside. The back door was closed, but I thought that Mrs. Blank didn't know that I was waiting to get into the party. And if I jumped up and down, you know, she would come to the window. And somebody came to the window, but nobody invited me to the party. And this girl, little girl, came down the stairs. And you know, children are cruel. They don't intend to be, it's their nature. All children are cruel. But she just repeated what her mother or father had said. And she said, "You cannot come to me party because you haven't got no da." And I think the new buildings East Jarrow changed from that day for me. I felt that I was rejected. I knew before that I hadn't got no da. But from that day on, life changed and I was going to show them. By God, I was going to show them.
Now she was going to stick up for herself. She was as good as them. With a swing of the long strap, she brought the bag in contact with the side of Janie's head. Janie screamed and kept on screaming. Rose Angela ran off, thinking, "I'm glad I hit her. I'm glad.
Catherine became quite aggressive at the age of about 9. She whipped the girl with a skipping rope in such a way that the father came round to Kate and said, "You've got to do something about Catherine. This can't go on." There was another episode where she pushed a little boy under the surface of the river water. He was only saved from drowning by a man who pulled him out.
Catherine's bullying stopped when she was hit to the ground by an older and bigger girl. Cut off from the other children, lonely and unhappy, she retreated inside herself.
I became more aware of the feeling of aloneness. I would be confronted by another being to whom I would talk and reason, for this being had a kind of cold aloofness I couldn't get at. It would not cooperate. It would not be comforted, for it was fast developing a life of its own, an all-knowing, desolate life, a negative life that told me there was nothing of any value, nothing worth striving for.
Catherine started telling stories to comfort herself.
I think she had a wonderful imagination. I didn't think so at the time. I took everything she said as gospel. I realised that she must have had a vivid imagination because of her stories.
Catherine would run truant from school and play in sheds on the edge of the Tyne.
There was a piece of corrugated iron on the water and it was making odd sounds. I was petrified. And she spun me such a tale. Who it was, and what it was somebody coming to get us because we weren't at school.
I had a vivid imagination, and I was a natural liar, you know.
Catherine found further fuel for her storytelling in the mystery of her absent father. He had disappeared after Kate became pregnant, and no one knew his identity.
I was told that my father was a gentleman. My Aunt Mary said he wore an astrakhan collar, and he carried a silver-mounted walking stick and black kid gloves, and oh, he did talk lovely.
The man that came in the carriage with the coat and the astrakhan collar and the silver-top cane, he was a gentleman. Well, he dressed like a gentleman. So therefore, Kitty would think, well, for all my mother wasn't married to this man, at least he was a gentleman. So she thinks, well, I should be a lady.
For years, I'd been terrified of two words. Seeing them written, hearing them, they used to make my muscles of my stomach curl up. The two words, bastard and illegitimate. Bastard and illegitimate. Because I didn't want anyone to know.
As Cookson grew into her teens, her fantasies took her far away from the back streets of Jarrow and the shadow of her illegitimacy. She liked to imagine herself as mistress of a grand house. In reality, she got a job at 18 as a laundry checker at the Harton Workhouse.
The first thing she did was to take all kinds of lessons for which she was ridiculed by other staff at Harton. She learned Indian juggling at one point. She took elocution lessons. She tried to learn French. She tried to learn the violin until all the inmates complained about the terrible noises that were issuing from her room as she was practicing.
She also did physical exercises. Right? I mean, she walked properly. She didn't want to just simply dress nicely. She wanted to wear the right kind of clothes. She wanted to be a lady.
I came across a book by Lord Chesterfield, Lord Chesterfield's Letters, and in it, Lord Chesterfield says that no man or woman can hope to become a lady or a gentleman unless they articulate correctly. And this was a man after my own heart.
Lord Chesterfield's Letters to his illegitimate son was a book really about how to behave properly, how to be honest to people, how to be kind, how to, in fact, lead a good, gentlemanly life.
He was the only man who gave me any education. He became my tutor, and the public library became my university.
And so he became my tutor, and the public library became my university.
And so he became my tutor, and the public library became my university, and that was the education.
As part of her self-improvement regime, Catherine wrote a play based on the life of the workhouse, which she sent to a correspondence club. It received a crushing rejection.
Written across the back page, slantwise, in red ink, were the words, "Strongly advise author not to take up writing as a career."
For the next 20 years, Catherine abandoned hopes of being a writer. She turned to other ways of bettering herself. Her good looks attracted the local pit lads, but she had set her sights on an older man, an insurance agent who went to their local church.
One Sunday morning, after Mass, who should come down the steps and stop and speak to me, but there's God. I cannot remember putting my feet to the ground from then till I got home. It was as if I had a visitation from God, because I'd seen this fellow from I was 14, you see.
Catherine turned her memories of this affair into another tale of her humiliation at the hands of others. She went out with the man for 2 years, but was snubbed by him at her 21st birthday party.
I felt he was ashamed of me. I was illegitimate. I think to myself, he's too big to sort of take any notice of that. But what else could it be, you see? It gradually came to me that I had been spurned, rejected for the 3rd time. And this was, my father didn't know that what he was doing to me. Neither did that child at the party, nor her mother. But that man knew. He was 11 years older than me. He knew all along.
Catherine was determined she was going to get out. Catherine had this attitude, I'm going to show them, I'm going to show them, I'm going to show them. I'm not just this illegitimate girl from the back streets. I am going to be somebody.
In 1928, at the age of 22, Catherine left the northeast. She went to Hastings, a prosperous, middle-class seaside resort, where she'd found herself a job as the manageress of a workhouse laundry.
The South was always slightly more genteel. The poverty was still there, but you didn't exactly see it the way it was up north.
Her job was well paid, and she was on the road to greater refinement, as long as no one found out about her past. She would talk freely, but only about certain things. I had something to hide, she said, so I appeared to have nothing to hide.
She was acting a part. When she went to Hastings, she allowed people to believe that she came from a much better background than she actually did. She tried to speak properly without a northeast accent, and she rarely talked about the circumstances of her home life. And that is a barrier. If you're going to make an intimate relationship with someone, then you've got to be able to talk about who you are and not carry on acting someone that you're not.
I don't think she was really happy. She may have had a great degree of contentment for her fulfillment, but I never saw her as a happy person.
Catherine made no friends in the workhouse, while many of the men she was attracted to turned out to be married. She was lonely and isolated. But there was one woman who was not put off by Catherine's frosty refinement.
She met Nan Smith when she was in the laundry. Nan Smith was, she employed her, and they became very, very good. She liked Nan. She was very jolly. She was exuberant. She was good. She was a little bit feckless, I think.
Catherine mentions Nan Smith only briefly in her autobiography, Our Kate. The only time she describes the depth of their relationship is in a previously unbroadcast tape interview made in the 1970s.
I thought she's done more for me than anybody in my life. Nobody had been as kind to me as she had, you see. She had taken my mother's place. She had done everything for me. So I went to the matron and I said, I'm going to be friends with her, openly, I said, and I'm going to sort of share my flat with her. She nearly went through the roof.
Catherine was putting her newfound status at risk by associating with Nan, an ordinary worker. Catherine, with all her pretensions to be a lady, was befriending a tough woman, 12 years her senior, and born in a workhouse.
Had her probably hair parted and cut straight down, like that, like that, and mannish tops. And I'm sure she wouldn't wear trousers in those days, but probably a very severe skirt.
She was mannish, but she wasn't a lesbian. I wouldn't have had anything to do with a lesbian, you know what I mean? And yet we lived together, we slept together. Because, you see, it was nothing to me. I'd slept with my mother, you see. People used to think that she had a hold over me. She had no hold over me, only her love for me.
There was nothing funny. It was just a case of, I shall try and domineer you, but nothing odd at all.
I think that Catherine could have had a lesbian relationship, yes. I think it was within her repertoire to have one, and she more or less said that to me, but not with Nan. They were not equals. She would not have had sex with anyone that she didn't look up to.
Catherine's ability to control her new life was tested to the limit when she allowed her mother, Kate, to come and live with her and Nan in Hastings. Catherine now fiercely opposed Kate's continued drinking. They clashed head-on.
Kate had these hobnail boots, and they were drying by the fire, and she picked them up, and one after the other she hurled them at Catherine, and one missed her face by millimetres.
Catherine felt humiliated by her drunken mother. "What have I done? What have I done?" she wrote in Our Kate. "Oh my God, not again, not in Hastings, not in this new way of life."
She said that she feared her mother. And it may be that what she meant was that she was afraid of her mother when she was drunk, rather than all the time. But the interview made her mother seem a very cruel person. And in fact, she said that her mother was a totally dominating person and she was afraid of her. And I couldn't resist saying at that point, "But surely you're a dominating person as well." And she said, no, I was afraid of her, she wasn't afraid of me. I just feel in that one detail, she probably didn't see herself as others might have seen her.
She looked at her mother, pitiable with age and slobbery fat. The thought came to her that age brought no respite. There still remained the worries, the fears and hurts, the tearing of one human being to shreds by another.
But Catherine made use of her mother. She rented out a set of rooms, which Kate ran for her as a boarding house.
I think Kitty used to get mad at her. She couldn't stand the drink. But people just liked Kate, you know. She would make people laugh. She was a marvellous cook, and she was a great person as a boarding housekeeper. She just had her little lapses sometimes, you know, and she was a great practical joker. She would cook this beautiful pastry with a lovely crust around it, and there's probably a scrubbing brush inside, and things like that. Or she would go down to the hole in the wall in Hastings and let my ma and Mrs. Flanagan and me look after the guests.
Catherine's boarding house business did well. 2 years on, she took out what was then a substantial mortgage of £1,000 in order to buy a large, decaying Victorian house.
Well, Catherine always talked about buying the Hurst as one of the defining moments of her life. This was a turning point. This is where she started to become the Catherine that she really wanted to be. She actually owned what she called a gentleman's residence. It had a butler's pantry. It had a wine cellar. It had 14 rooms.
It's flaming cold. I know that much. God, dear, oh dear. Had a huge drawing room. Brilliant grand piano. Grandfather clock at the end of the stairs, which always seemed to boom when I had to go up it. But it was a nice house. Had lots of character and things. It was her first house of her dreams.
Catherine was now a lady, but life in her new house did not run according to plan. Catherine's boarding house, the Hurst, was run for her by her mother and Nan. For a while, all three women lived there, but their tight-knit world was turned on its head in 1936 when Catherine met Tom Cookson, a young maths teacher, 6 years her junior.
It happened within 2 days. I was very, very shy, but something hit me. People say hit you and you poo-poo it, but something got me because I could not rest for the next day. I knew I had got to see and hear. That's always been important to me, to hear this woman.
I think he was the first man that Catherine felt really comfortable with and that she felt she could talk to in a way that was natural and where she didn't have to be or pretend to be someone she wasn't.
Although Tom had fallen for Catherine completely, her feelings for him were complicated by Nan, as her tape interview reveals.
I was going with Tom. I'd invited him to this dance, and she came up in the bedroom and she said to me, if you take him across there to that dance, I'll hang myself the time you're out. You won't find me alive when you come back. And I just stayed back there, crying my eyes out, fighting with her till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Tom was very easy to belittle. He was a small man, and Nan did her best to put Catherine off Tom and to suggest that she might be better off with a real man, as only a woman can do.
Catherine split up with Tom. The relations between Catherine, Nan and her mother were now severely strained. It took 2 years before she disentangled herself by moving Nan out of the Hurst and sending her mother back to Tyneside. She was reunited with Tom and married him in 1940. She gave up her job to become a grammar school teacher's wife.
Everyone respected him in the town, and that was something Catherine gained. You know, tremendous respect, because she married Tom.
Tom had the education, he'd been to Oxford, had the education she hadn't had. He was going to be important in her quest for bettering herself, another reason why they got on. She also found him attractive. She did say that to me, you know, physically attractive.
Over the war years, Catherine accompanied Tom as he was posted by the RAF around the country. During this time, she suffered 4 miscarriages due to an undiagnosed hereditary blood disease, which made it impossible for her to carry a baby to term.
I wanted to wreak retribution on somebody or something, especially for losing the babies. If I saw a child in the pram, it was beautiful, and the mother smiling, I was so mad that I just would, if I'd had a half a brick in my hand, would have gone through a window. I just wanted to tip it up. I was at a hair's breadth of injuring a child.
Catherine turned to writing as a way of escaping herself, making up fantasies about life among the upper classes. But everything she did was swamped by fear.
Fear had been my companion since a tiny child. Fear of drink, of Kate in drink. Fear of the priest and of his admonition from behind the grid. Fear of loving and of slipping the way of Kate.
She had married a non-Catholic, and various priests she consulted at various times gave her different responses to her fears about what this would mean for her. One of them in particular had said that she had committed a mortal sin in marrying a non-Catholic.
A great consuming, agonizing fear. Fear of doctors, fear of operations, fear of going mad, fear. I turned into a solid block of fear.
She vomited constantly. She was terrified to be alone. She couldn't sleep alone at night. She actually went to sleep with neighbours during the night. She was afraid of what God would do to her. Some days she'd feel good, and some days she would feel like committing suicide.
Unable to cope, Catherine went to a mental asylum, where she was given electric shock therapy.
I wouldn't wish the devil in hell to have Peter. The devil in hell to have Peter. The devil in hell to have Peter.
I could see nothing good that had happened to me all those years. I couldn't remember laughing, I couldn't remember a joke. And then, as I got better and saw straighter, it was a breakdown that brought me to myself. It was a breakdown that made me realize that I wasn't Catherine Cookson, that underneath this facade of the grammar school master's wife, I was Katie McMullen from East Jarrow, and that this was the real person, and this was the person that had a right.
Catherine discarded her drawing room dramas. She now wanted her writing to confront her feelings of shame about her background.
And she passionately wanted to exorcise her early life. I think this was it, you know. I will show what that life was like, and I'm getting out of it. She really, in a way, it was a kind of a therapy as well.
Catherine's pain about her past evolved into her first novel, Kate Hannigan. Written when she was 46, It's the story of an illegitimate girl and her mother in Tyne Dock. Its potential was obvious.
For a first novel, it was very, very professional. It was very direct, very powerful, and the most important thing was that you felt she knew exactly what she was writing about. And she had this very powerful way of getting the characters to sound exactly as if they were talking themselves.
Kate jerked to a halt, as if a bullet had struck her in the back. She'd no time to think before Mrs. Luck screamed words that seemed to freeze her blood. "It's coming to something, by God it is! Who do you think you're talking to, brazen hussy? No wonder your bairn brags in the street that the doctor is a dar. She gets her barefacedness from the right one, you bloody upstart, you!"
You felt that she had walked through this place, she knew these people, she knew everything about them, and she got it on paper.
And I thought, that's it. But it wasn't. The breakdown was still with me. And then I had to face up to the fact that all this was still a facade. I wasn't getting inside at all.
For 3 years, Catherine continued to write, hoping with each new novel to lift herself out of the breakdown. But she was still tortured by her feelings about her past.
She needed to come to terms with who she was. And in coming to terms with who she was coming to terms with the fact that she was part of Kate, who in many times she loathed.
I'd been wanting her to die for years. She had been the plague of my life. I was 47 then, and she had been on my back, as I thought, for years. It was a love-hate relationship.
In 1953, Catherine's mother was diagnosed with stomach cancer. She was only given a few months to live. In a final attempt at reconciliation, Catherine brought Kate down to Hastings.
Once I got her back in that house, I thought, no, she mustn't die. She must live, and we must get to know each other. And so for 3 years, we lived together, and we had peace, and we laughed.
Kate died in Hastings in 1956. With her mother gone, Catherine now felt able to write more freely about her family life.
And so I wrote Our Kate. And it was just like as if I'd put a hoover inside myself and swept it all out. When I finished that first draft, it was full of bitterness. The bitterness came up off the page. I felt relieved, but I thought I could never publish this.
Catherine carried on writing and rewriting Our Kate for 12 years, trying to come to terms with her bitter feelings about her life.
I don't know of any other autobiographer who had so much difficulty. She told me, I think, that she rewrote her autobiography, Our Kate, some 10 or 12 times. And I know of one other autobiographer, namely Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, who had to write and rewrite his autobiography many times. And in both cases, I'm quite convinced that the reason was that they couldn't come to terms with their relationship with their parents.
Our Kate was finally published in 1969. From then on, Cookson clung to this version of her life, even to the surprise of her own family.
People couldn't quite believe what was in the autobiography, and they couldn't believe that Kitty could say these things. But then again, Kitty was well known then, and so therefore they had no reason to say this wasn't true. But I think the reaction was a little bit of a shock in certain places that Kitty could talk about Aunt Kate like this or speak about her like that.
Cookson repeated the stories in Our Kate almost verbatim for the next 30 years. But it remains a partial view of her life.
For most of the events of Catherine's life and for most of her relationships, we only have Catherine as a witness, and we have no way of knowing just how true it was.
One of the things Cookson never wrote about was the identity of her father. She had made an abortive attempt to find him as a teenager, but never tried again in later life.
I don't think she ever really wanted to meet him, because I think she could have done. I mean, somebody must have known who he was. I mean, good heavens, in a working class background like that. She didn't really want to, because that would have really have brought him down to earth. She said she did, but I don't know.
In Our Kate, she presents him as an unsolvable mystery. Yet a biographer has recently traced his probable identity. He is Alexander Pate, who called himself Alexander Davis, the name of the father on Catherine's birth certificate. His known descendants also share Catherine's rare hereditary blood disease. Pate would have been married with children at the time of having the affair with Kate.
The stories that I heard was that he was just very good looking. He was a gambler.
We were always brought up on the idea he was a good-looking knout.
He had the long black coat with the astrakhan collar and a walking stick.
He gambled the furniture out of the house, is what I was told.
I think it's possible that Catherine knew more than she ever told anyone. She wrote a novel 2 years after Kate died, called The Gambling Man, about a charming rogue who also ends up bigamously married to 2 women.
He had no false modesty about his personal attraction. He knew that many a back door would have been left open for him if he just raised an eyebrow or answered a gleam in a hungry woman's eyes. He didn't class himself as particularly handsome, but was aware that he had something which was of greater appeal.
Her mother must have told her enough about her father for Catherine to feel that she didn't want to, that he wasn't a person that she would really want to know.
Since she was first published, Cookson had written non-stop, issuing 1 or 2 books a year, but still only in hardback. She was not in the bestseller league. But at the end of the 60s, things changed radically with her first successful paperback deal.
So what has the success as an author meant to you then? What does it mean to you?
Hard work, still. 10 to 12 hours a day, because I can't stop now. That is the trouble. The doctor's told me to stop. Tom begs me to stop. I can't stop. Because what would I do with my time? What would I do with myself? All I've got left now is this.
Cookson's writing was now centre stage. She was a top-selling author, and by the mid-70s, it had made her a millionaire. She and her husband decided to move back to the northeast. Tom retired at 57, in order to devote all his time to Catherine and her work.
Tom, her husband, who was completely wonderful, was completely at her beck and call. He did what Catherine said. When one went to see her, she would order Tom around. I mean, Tom would pick us up from the station, Tom would cook the lunch, Tom would clear up. I mean, she sort of employed Tom. I mean, that was technically how it worked.
When I did retire, I said, well, I'll retire under one condition, that you let me take over the kitchen. I'll do the cooking and 1 or 2 other things and the housework and so on.
Tom would bring in a plate of cakes that he had made, and she would say, I'd say, oh, these are lovely. And she would say, yes, they're very nice. They are very nice. He makes them quite well. Doesn't really make them like I do, of course.
She was an indomitable woman. You had to have your wits about you the whole time. But I think it was both ways. I really do. I think Catherine would have gone off the rails without Tom, and I think she knew it.
Cookson, now in her 70s, was a celebrity, and people were queuing up to interview her and write about her.
John Smith, when he left the agency and retired, suggested, I think it came from John, that he should write a biography of Catherine. And that was partly because lots and lots of people wanted to write biographies, and she always resisted them. I mean, she hated the idea of somebody delving around in her private life.
Nan, the shadowy friend, almost totally excluded from Our Kate, featured heavily in research interviews Smith conducted with Catherine. Catherine and Tom had renewed their friendship with Nan towards the end of her life. Nan died while Catherine was away, but Tom was with her.
The only only thing I want you to do, she said, is in that drawer, there's a bundle of letters. I want you to have it. I phoned and I said, I'm coming home for the... He said, no, you don't. You stay where you are until the funeral's over. I said, why? He said, do as I tell you. When I get in the house, and I say to him, you know, Tom, I feel guilty. He said, shut up and look at that.
There were things in there that she hadn't told Tom. Things about men that had been in Catherine's life that Tom didn't know about. And she'd been married to Tom for about 30 years at this point. Catherine said it rocked the foundations of her marriage.
One of the first letters I read went on about all these men that I'd had. My character was absolutely gone in that letter. I was consumed with this hate. I realized it was evil. She had planned all this.
She was almost like a demon. She said, I said to Tom, I want to go to the graveyard and dig up the stones out of the grave and take the bones of Nan Smith out and smash them into pieces.
John, I was burnt up with this hate. If I could have got her out of the grave, I think I would have choked a skeleton. It was so terrible.
And then it was fine. And she sort of sank back, rather almost like a paroxysm. But it was a kind of bitterness, absolute bitterness.
The finished biography was sent up to Cookson for her approval. She made it plain that she did not want it to be published.
I didn't want to do something where I was going to upset, you know, I suppose the biggest selling author at that time on our list. I mean, she was then immensely popular.
37 wonderful years.
Cookson's iron grip over her image and the people surrounding her never slackened.
People did kowtow to her. They did tend to want to do what she wanted to do.
She could be horrible, actually. She could be really horrible and pretty rude on the phone. She would ring and she would expect Anthony to be available. And he quite often wasn't, because he was in a meeting or on another phone call dealing with another client. And if that was the case and he wasn't available, she would always want to speak to me and would demand to do so. And, well, she did make the agency a phenomenal amount of money, and she was a very important client. So one had to scramble to it a bit.
When our first book came out together in the mid-80s, there was an error towards the end of the book, and she'd even read the proofs and not picked it up, and I was some 2 hours sitting on the stairs of my home in London while she let me have it, let rip.
But on the other hand, she could ring up the next day and be sweetness and light.
She had a lot of acquaintances, because she always used to say, you only have one true friend and everybody else is an acquaintance.
You don't look the same.
If people didn't give her the adulation at times, I suppose to her it was a little bit like a drug. She did need it, almost like needing a fix. She needed these occasions.
Can I put it on there?
I was very aware that she had this dual personality, that she was a depressive.
All the names of all the people in the Newgate, everyone.
I don't feel that Catherine would ever have revealed the inner part of herself, the feelings, the centre of her being, the essence of her. I don't think that would ever have come out, and I don't think she revealed that, not even to Tom.
I always felt there was a little barrier beyond which she wouldn't go. She was frightened almost of friendship, of too close friendships.
For Catherine, the high points of her later years were the many honours she received. She was awarded the OBE, made a Dame of the British Empire, and presented with several honorary degrees.
To my mind, up to the very end, she never felt she had achieved what might be her full ambition. But she did, it did make her enormously happy to achieve certain watersheds. But you may be certain that by the next day, she was back at her desk and determined to scale the next height.
But her working life became limited by her illness. Her hereditary blood disorder had been getting steadily worse, causing debilitating heavy bleeds.
She could just be sitting talking or reading or just having a laugh, and then she would just suddenly spurt this blood, you know, and it was like all hands on deck, panic. The doctor would come and probably plug it or cauterize it, and could hear her making a noise, so it was obviously painful. And Mr. Cookson would be like outside just screwing his face up and, you know, wishing it was him and not her, you know. But it was quite frightening at times for the volume of blood that come out, you know. You just couldn't imagine anybody had that much sometimes.
Catherine Cookson died on the 11th of June 1998. She was 92 and had written 103 books, read by millions throughout the world.
I remember when I heard that she died, the words that came to my lips, unwilled, were, "There's a great spirit gone." The spirit in Catherine Cookson was really quite exceptional.
Tom Cookson died a fortnight later. Their final estate was worth nearly £30 million, most of which was left to the Cookson Charitable Foundation. Right up to her death, Cookson struggled with how much she wanted to tell about herself. In one previously unbroadcast interview, she revealed she was working on a fuller account of the crucial events in her life.
Several people have tried to write an autobiography, my life, but it hasn't worked. What I'm doing now, in between times, have been doing for the last year or so, the real facts, not that our kid wasn't the real facts, but there was 1,001 things that happened to me. Why did I have the breakdown, really? Why?
Nothing was ever found of this work after Catherine's death.
There is a sense in which you could say she wanted to keep the script right. It was that how on earth could anybody else, how on earth could you understand what I was feeling when Kate was breathing whiskey on my face at 7 years of age? How could you appreciate? You're going to find out the reasons that are not true.
I'm a nasty individual. Really horrible in some parts of me. Because we've always got our thoughts, you know, we always got our deeper instincts, and mine come out at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm lying here awake and thinking this, that and the other.
On her deathbed, she did not want the truth to come out for other people. Whether she understood what had happened and understood her own reaction to the past at that crucial point in her pilgrimage through life, I don't know, but I suspect that she didn't want the truth. At one point, she obviously felt that the truth ought to be told. And yet, at the end of her life, she felt it mustn't be told.
Next Thursday at 9 o'clock, a new chilling perspective on the Fred West murders. Details coming up. Well, next here on 4, Ross can't have Rachel, but he can have the next best thing, Rachel's sister.